A European engineer brought his modern drills to this land, and failed. He declared it waterless and walked away, leaving behind a parched earth where children could only wash their hands with red dust. Hope was gone. Until a group of Vietnamese soldiers appeared. They had no million-dollar budget, no geological scanners. They only had bamboo, clay, and an idea everyone thought was insane: if you can't drill down, you must make the water change its course. And then, a strange thing happened. It wasn't a miracle. It was science, and heart. This is not just the story of a well. This is the journey of a Vietnamese flag planted in dry soil, from which clean water began to rise. This is the story of the Vietnam well, and how a small country achieved what the world had given up on. The sun over the village of Kulul was not a source of life but a merciless blacksmith, hammering the landscape into a brittle, ochre canvas of despair. It had been months since hope had a name here, ever since it had been packed away in steel crates and driven off in a cloud of triumphant dust. Left behind was its monument, the skeletal remains of a drilling rig, a steel specter that threw a long, mocking shadow across the cracked earth each afternoon. This was the legacy of Marcus, the European engineer, a man whose confidence had been as gleaming and impenetrable as his machinery. Marcus himself had not quite departed. He lingered at the edge of the Unisfa compound, a ghost in his own failed narrative. He watched the village with the weary arrogance of a man who mistakes his own failure for a universal truth. He had come armed with geological charts, seismic sensors, and a drill that could shatter granite. Yet, the earth had defied him, offering up only rock, then more rock, a stubborn, silent refusal. His final report, a symphony of technical jargon concluding that the land was irredeemably barren, had become the village's gospel of futility. The people of Kulul no longer prayed for rain, they had learned the harder lesson of praying for nothing at all. Children, once vibrant, now moved with a listless quiet, their games forgotten in the face of a thirst too profound to be playful. Into this profound silence arrived Major Alex Ivanov and his contingent. They did not roll in with the clamor of conquest or the arrogance of saviors. They moved with the quiet, synchronized rhythm of farmers tending to a familiar field, their discipline a stark contrast to the chaotic energy that had preceded them. As they unloaded their supplies, a quiet curiosity rippled through the village. From the shadowed doorways of their huts, the people watched. There were no gleaming engines, no complex consoles. Instead, the soldiers laid out coils of rope, stacks of unassuming bamboo poles, and heavy canvas sacks that sagged with the weight of dry, powdered earth. This humble display was enough to draw Marcus from his perch. He walked towards Ivanov, his boots crunching on the parched ground, each step a small punctuation of disdain. A faint, corrosive smirk touched his lips. He surveyed the simple tools, then looked at the spot where his own drill had been defeated, and finally, his gaze settled on the major. "You intend to dig here?" he asked, the words slow, each one dripping with condescension. He crossed his arms, a fortress of certainty. It was not a question, but a final, pitying judgment. Major Ivanov, whose weathered face seemed a map of patience rather than hardship, did not flinch. He did not look at Marcus, but past him, his eyes fixed on the land as if in quiet conference with an old, respected adversary. He let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of Marcus's disbelief to hang in the shimmering air before it dissolved into irrelevance. "We have no pressure drills," Ivanov conceded, his voice calm and even, a startling admission in a world that equated power with success. He paused, letting the statement stand on its own, stripped of any apology. He then turned his gaze slowly to meet Marcus's, and in his eyes was a deep, unwavering clarity. "But we have clay." The word, so elemental and unassuming, landed with the force of a revelation. It was a word that belonged to potters and riverbeds, not to engineers and geologists. For a moment, Marcus was speechless. It was an answer so fundamentally alien to his worldview that he had no ready retort. It was the logic of water, not of force, of yielding, not of breaking. As Marcus finally turned away with a disbelieving shake of his head, muttering about wasted time, a new sound began to fill the air. It was the soft scrape of shovels, the thud of mallets, and the low, steady cadence of men working in unison. They were not attacking the earth. They were beginning a slow, respectful dialogue with it, their quiet labor a balm on the violent memory of the drill that had only scarred the land and left it bleeding dust. And for the first time in a long time, a few of the villagers did not turn away. They watched. The work that unfolded in the days that followed was less an act of engineering and more a form of terrestrial choreography. It began not as an assault, but as a conversation whispered into the parched skin of the land. Where Marcus's colossal drill had screamed, a violent monologue of steel against stone, Major Ivanov's men moved with a quiet, rhythmic grace that seemed to belong to another time. Their shovels did not tear at the earth but sliced it cleanly, peeling back its layers with the precision of a surgeon. They were not digging a hole, they were sculpting a possibility. The shape that slowly emerged was not a wound drilled deep into the planet's flesh, but an open palm, a great earthen chalice turned towards the heavens. It was a funnel, nearly 3 meters wide at its mouth, its sides sloping gently inward in a geometry of deliberate invitation. This was a design born not from textbooks, but from the unwritten lore of rice paddies and monsoon-fed rivers, a knowledge passed down through generations that had learned to coax life from stubborn soil. Each shovelful of earth was removed with purpose, each contour shaped by a shared, unspoken understanding. Under the relentless gaze of the sun, the soldiers toiled, their movements a study in discipline and economy. Sweat did not streak their faces with the grime of defeat but gleamed on their skin like a sacred oil, a testament to a resolve that burned hotter than the midday heat. Ivanov orchestrated the symphony of labor not with shouted commands, but with a subtle cant of his head, a quiet word, a gesture that was both instruction and encouragement. His men moved as one organism, their shared purpose a silent language that needed no translation. They were following a map invisible to the outside eye, a map drawn from ancestral memory, a diagram of how to respectfully ask the earth for its secrets. The true alchemy began when they brought forth the clay. They mixed the fine, gray powder with precious, rationed water, their hands working the mixture until it became a dark, pliable skin, the very substance of creation. With a reverence that bordered on ritual, they began to line the great funnel. They did not slap it on, but smoothed it with their bare hands, pressing it into every porous surface, sealing every crack and fissure. It was an act of profound intimacy, a sealing of a pact. This was not just a liner, it was a membrane, a promise to the hidden water that if it chose to move, its path would be held secure and guided with care. From the shade of the Unisva compound, Marcus watched, his arms crossed, a solitary figure of fortified doubt. To his Western-trained mind, it was a breathtaking study in futility, a primitive effort doomed from the start. He saw men fighting a geological certainty with little more than mud and misplaced hope. Yet, as the days wore on, a grudging fascination began to erode his cynicism. He was an engineer, after all. He understood the immutable laws of pressure and flow. And he began to see the quiet genius in their folly. They were not trying to shatter the impenetrable layer of rock below. They were creating a path of least resistance around it, a gentle bypass. They were not conquering the water, they were coaxing it, persuading it to abandon its ancient, stubborn course for one of their own design. The logic was both profoundly simple and infuriatingly elegant, a wisdom his expensive machinery had been too loud and too arrogant to hear. And every day, from the meager shade of a skeletal acacia tree, the small girl with the empty yellow can bore witness. She was the village's silent vigil, a small, still anchor in a shimmering sea of heat. Her gaze was not one of idle curiosity. It was a deep, focused observation, her entire being concentrated on the slow, deliberate actions of these strange, quiet men. She watched them dig. She watched them mix the clay. She watched them lay the interlocking sections of bamboo that would act as gentle guides for the water, should it ever come. In her small hands, the plastic can was not an object, but an extension of her very being, a physical manifestation of a hope so fragile she dared not speak its name. She was the village's collective memory of disappointment, and yet, in her unwavering presence, there was a glimmer of something new. She was a constant, quiet question posed to the universe: will this time be different? On the seventh day, the final layer of clay was smoothed into place. The physical work was complete. The great funnel stood waiting, its smooth, dark walls glistening faintly in the sun. It was at once a vessel, an altar, and a question posed to the silent, unyielding earth. The soldiers, weary but resolute, stepped back, their faces betraying nothing but a deep, abiding calm. The village held its breath. The stage was set, not for a violent eruption of power, but for a quiet answer from the deep. The 10th day dawned with no more promise than the 9 that had preceded it. The sky was a vast, indifferent canvas of pale, washed-out blue, and the sun resumed its relentless siege upon the land. The village of Kulul awoke to the familiar ache of its morning thirst, a dull throb of endurance that had become the rhythm of their lives. Yet, something in the air had shifted. It was an almost imperceptible change, a tension that was not born of fear, but of a fragile, unspoken anticipation. At the sight of the well, the soldiers stood not as laborers, but as sentinels. For 2 days, since the completion of the great earthen funnel, they had maintained this quiet vigil. It was a period of waiting that felt heavier than the most strenuous labor, a suspended breath held by the entire village. Then, on the morning of this 10th day, the change occurred. It was not a dramatic gusher, no triumphant explosion of water that would have satisfied the world's craving for spectacle. It was something far more subtle, and for that reason, far more profound. From a single, infinitesimal point near the bottom of the great, clay-lined basin, the smooth, dark surface began to weep. A tiny, glistening tear of moisture appeared, catching the morning light like a fallen star. It did not gush, it simply was. It grew, not with force, but with a quiet, inexorable persistence, until it formed a single, perfect droplet that clung to the clay before finally letting go. It fell with a soft pat, a sound so small it should have been lost in the vastness of the landscape, but in the profound silence, it broke a spell. It was the sound of a promise being kept. Major Ivanov, who had been kneeling at the rim, his gaze unwavering, saw it first. He did not call out, did not celebrate. He remained perfectly still, as if witnessing a sacred and intensely private birth. One by one, his men, noticing his absolute stillness, followed his gaze. A collective, inaudible gasp rippled through them. They were not witnessing a success of engineering, but a moment of communion. A dark, wet patch began to spread from that first point, a slow, steady pulse from the heart of the earth. This was the moment the little girl with the yellow can had been waiting for. For 10 days, she had been a silent statue, a sentinel of skepticism. Now, as if released from a spell, she moved. She walked forward, her small, bare feet making no sound on the dusty ground. The crowd of onlookers parted for her, a silent, instinctual acknowledgement that this moment belonged to her, the keeper of the village's deepest and most patient thirst. She approached the lip of the funnel, her eyes wide, fixed on the miraculous flow. A young soldier, his face etched with a kindness that transcended language, saw her. He said nothing, but knelt and held a clean, metal cup beneath the nascent stream until it was full. He offered it to her. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her gaze flicking from the cup to the soldier's face, a lifetime of broken promises warring with this simple, offered truth. Then, with a solemnity that belied her years, she took it. She did not drink immediately. She brought the cup to her nose, inhaling its scent, or rather, its profound lack of scent. It smelled of an absence of dust, of sickness, of stagnant despair. It smelled of life. She took a small, tentative sip. Her eyes closed. Then she took another, longer drink, the cool water spilling down her chin, washing away a streak of red dust and leaving a clean, pale trail on her skin. When she opened her eyes again, the hardness in them, the protective shield of a child who had learned not to want, had dissolved. A slow, wondrous smile spread across her face. It was not a smile of ecstatic joy, but of a profound, soul-deep relief. It was the smile of a prisoner tasting freedom for the first time. In that one, simple expression, the entire village felt its own tightly coiled skepticism finally unwind and release. That single act broke the dam. An old man, the one who had once told Ivanov that his mouth had grown tired of drinking false hope, stepped forward. His own metal cup, dented and scarred, trembled in his hand. He filled it, drank deeply, and then closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a clean path through the deep lines of his face. "It is sweet," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he had thought long dead. "Like the water of my youth." That afternoon, the name was born. It was not suggested by the soldiers or decreed by a village elder. It began as a murmur among the women waiting in line, a phrase whispered from one to another as they filled their containers. Giang Vietnam. The Vietnam well. It was spoken with a sense of wonder and of ownership, a recognition that this water was different, not just in its purity, but in its very essence. It had not come from a machine that had screamed at the earth, but from the quiet persistence and strange, gentle wisdom of these men from a distant land. The name stuck, instantly and irrevocably. It was not a label of ownership, but a title of honor, a way to forever bind this miraculous, life-giving water to the quiet, dignified men who had listened to the earth and taught it how to speak again. The water that flowed from the Vietnam well became more than a simple resource, it became the village's new, steady heartbeat. Its clean, cool pulse washed away not only the dust and the threat of disease, but also the deep, lingering residue of despair. But Major Ivanov, a man who understood that true strength lies not in gifts received but in wisdom shared, knew that the most vital work was yet to come. The water could quench a physical thirst, but only knowledge could quench the thirst for dignity and self-reliance. The real work, the work of permanence, was about to begin. His first student was Ali. He sought out the old man whose skepticism had been the hardest to melt, for he knew that a convert's faith is often the most profound. The lessons did not take place in a classroom with charts and diagrams. The classroom was the living earth itself, the textbook was the well in all its elegant simplicity, and the language was one of hands, intuition, and a shared, patient silence. Ivanov and his men taught Ali not just the mechanics of the system, but its very spirit. They showed him how to check the integrity of the clay lining, not by sight alone, but by placing a palm flat against the cool ground and feeling for the subtle vibrations that signaled a healthy flow. They taught him to listen. "A happy well has a song," Ivanov explained through a translator, his hand resting on one of the main bamboo pipes as if feeling a pulse. "It is a low, steady hum. When the flow is blocked or the pressure is weak, the song changes. It becomes a whisper of complaint. You must learn to hear it before it becomes a cry." Ali, a man whose hands had only ever known the rough, honest grain of wood and the unyielding heft of an axe, now learned a new and delicate craft. He learned to feel the subtle shift in water pressure through the tautness of a rope. He learned to recognize the hollow sound of a loose joint. He learned to mix the fine clay to the perfect, silken consistency required to patch a weeping seam. He was no longer a passive recipient of aid, he was becoming a custodian, a guardian of a sacred trust. Other villagers, drawn by his quiet, focused transformation, joined him. Soon, a small, dedicated group began to form around the well each morning, their lessons a silent sacrament performed at dawn, their hands learning the new catechism of valves and seals. From this core group, the guardians of the well were born. With a quiet, communal pride, they fashioned armbands from scraps of the same red cloth that had first adorned their water cans, a simple, powerful symbol of their new stewardship. It was a role they wore with a profound, almost solemn dignity. Their posture changed. They walked with the bearing of men and women entrusted with their community's most precious treasure. They managed the daily distribution with an even hand, ensuring fairness. They conducted meticulous checks on the system, their red armbands flickering like small flames of defiance against the monochrome landscape. The well was no longer something the Vietnamese soldiers had given them, it was something they now actively possessed and protected. It was on a Tuesday, when the sun was at its most merciless and the air shimmered with heat, that the dust on the horizon was disturbed by the approach of something alien. Two gleaming white land cruisers, emblazoned with the bold blue insignia of the United Nations, rolled into Kulal, their pristine finish an almost violent intrusion on the earthy, sun-baked palate of the village. They came to a halt in a bubble of air-conditioned certainty, their engines humming with an imported authority. Out stepped three figures, their crisp uniforms and polished boots a world away from the sweat-stained, earth-caked fatigues of Ivanov's men. They were led by a woman named Evelyn Reed, a senior coordinator from the Nairobi regional office. She held a clipboard like a scepter, a shield of bureaucracy, and her expression was one of polite but distant efficiency. She approached Major Ivanov, who met her with his customary, unreadable calm. "Major," she began, foregoing pleasantries, her voice clipped and professional. "We're here to conduct a final field verification. Our records indicate this water project was completed under the auspices of the Ugandan contingent. We just need to sign off on the operational report to finalize the funding allocation." The silence that followed was absolute, a sudden, suffocating void. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a collective, unspoken indignation. Ivanov's soldiers froze where they stood, their faces hardening into masks of disbelief and anger. Yet Ivanov himself did not react. He simply held Evelyn Reed's gaze, his silence more profound and more damning than any protest. Before he could formulate a response, however, a new voice cut through the stillness. It was Ali. He stepped forward from the group of guardians, his red armband a slash of defiant color against his dark skin. The years seemed to fall away from him. His stooped posture straightened, and his eyes, once clouded with doubt, now burned with the fierce, protective fire of a man defending his home. "What did she say about Uganda?" he asked, his voice clear and ringing, stripped of all its former hesitancy and imbued with an authority that came from the earth itself. Evelyn turned, slightly startled by the directness of the interruption from a local. "This is an official UN matter," she began, a touch of condescension in her tone, but Ali was not to be dismissed. "I know nothing of your official matters," he said, taking another step forward, his gnarled finger pointing not at her, but at his own chest. "But I know these hands." He held them up, palms open, showing the calluses new and old. "These hands learned how to patch a leaking pipe from that soldier there." He pointed to a young Vietnamese man, who looked startled by the attention. "I saw these men sweat under the same sun that burns us. I saw them work when they thought no one was watching. I saw them share their own food with our children when their own rations were low." He turned his fiery gaze back to Evelyn, his voice rising with passion. "There was no one else here. Only them. They did not give us water. They gave us back our land." His words, spoken with the irrefutable authority of a witness, hung in the air. Evelyn Reed was momentarily speechless. Before she could recover, another guardian, an old woman named Zara with a face like a beautiful, cracked riverbed, stepped up beside Ali. "If you write the wrong name in your book," she said, her voice raspy but carrying an astonishing strength, "I will personally carry a jug of this water all the way to Nairobi. I will walk to your big office, and I will pour it on your desk myself, so you can see where it came from." A ripple of laughter, fierce and proud, went through the assembled villagers. The children, sensing the shift in power, began to chant softly, a refrain that had become their anthem, "Gieng Vietnam. Gieng Vietnam." Evelyn Reed looked from the unshakable face of Ali, to the fiery eyes of the old woman, to the sea of resolute faces behind them, and finally, back to the silent, dignified Major Ivanov. For the first time, she truly saw. She saw the truth, not written on the sterile pages of her official documents, but etched into the very soul of the community standing before her. She lowered her clipboard, the shield now feeling flimsy and useless. "I see," she said, her professional mask finally cracking to reveal a flicker of human understanding and humility. "There appears to have been a significant error in our reporting." She looked directly at Ivanov, and then at Ali, her gaze holding a newfound respect. "My sincere apologies. I will ensure the record is corrected immediately." As the white vehicles drove away, their dust settling back into the earth, they left behind not a feeling of triumph for the soldiers, but a profound sense of affirmation for the villagers. They had not just been given water, they had been given a voice. And on this day, they had used it to defend a truth they now held as sacred. The guardians stood a little taller, their red armbands no longer just a symbol of their duty, but a testament to their victory. They were the keepers of the well, and they had just proven, to the world and to themselves, that they were also the keepers of its soul. The day of departure arrived not with the suddenness of a storm, but with the quiet, inevitable drift of a season turning. It was a knowledge that settled over the village of Kulo like the morning mist, unspoken but universally understood. The Vietnamese contingent's mission was drawing to a close. There was no official announcement posted, no date circled on a calendar, but the village felt it in the subtle shift of the atmosphere. They saw it in the way the soldiers began to pack their few personal belongings with a gentle, almost tender finality, folding uniforms that had become a second skin, their movements imbued with a quiet sense of completion. They had taught the guardians everything they knew. The well was now a self-sustaining organism, its lifeblood flowing not just from the deep, hidden arteries of the earth, but from the hands and hearts of the people themselves. On the final evening, the soldiers had planned a simple meal amongst themselves, a last supper of shared rice and quiet reflection. But Kulo, in its newfound voice and spirit, would not allow such a solitary farewell. As dusk began to bleed purple and gold across the horizon, the village came to them. It was not a formal, orchestrated procession, but a slow, organic pilgrimage. They came from their huts one by one, in small family groups, their silhouettes emerging from the fading light, moving towards the soft glow of the lanterns at the Vietnamese camp. They came bearing gifts, not of monetary value, but of profound substance. An old woman, her face a beautiful map of a long life, brought a small basket of freshly dug sweet potatoes, the earth still clinging to their skins, her offering held forth with gnarled, proud hands. A young man, barely more than a boy, led a small, bleeding goat by a rope, a significant sacrifice, a gesture of immense respect from a family with little to spare. And the children, usually a whirlwind of chaotic energy, approached with a shy, wide-eyed reverence. They hid behind their parents' legs, peeking out, before darting forward to press crumpled, treasured drawings into the soldiers' hands, vibrant, crayon-scrawled scenes of a deep blue well, a brilliant red and gold flag flying in a cloudless sky, and smiling men in green uniforms standing side by side with smiling children with red armbands. The entire village encircled the soldiers, not in a tight, suffocating ring that demanded attention, but in a wide, warm embrace that offered comfort and community. A bonfire was lit, its flames leaping and dancing against the deepening twilight, illuminating a tableau of shared humanity that transcended all barriers of language and culture. There were no speeches, no grand, hollow pronouncements. There was only the quiet language of shared food, of laughter that bubbled up effortlessly, and of eyes that met across the firelight and communicated a gratitude too profound for words. In the midst of this gentle celebration, Ali stepped forward into the sacred circle of light. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a high priest. He held in his hands not a gift of food, but something heavy, something ancient and eternal. It was a large, flat stone, its surface worn smooth by the passage of forgotten waters and eons of time. It was one of the very stones they had painstakingly removed from the earth during the first agonizing days of digging, a relic of the initial, seemingly insurmountable obstacle. It was a symbol of their first failure, now transformed. He presented it to Major Ivanov. In the flickering, dancing light of the fire, the Major could see that the stone's surface was no longer blank. It had been meticulously carved, not with the cold precision of a master craftsman's chisel, but with the patient, determined hand of someone inscribing a sacred text, every mark a testament to effort and devotion. The carving was simple, almost childlike in its directness, which only amplified its power. Kulo 2022, Water. Kulo 2024, Clean Water. By Vietnam. It was not a plaque of polished brass that would tarnish. It was not a monument commissioned by a distant institution. It was a piece of the very earth they had healed, transformed into a testament that would endure. It was the village's history, its long struggle, and its ultimate salvation, etched into the foundational rock of their world. Ivanov accepted it with both hands, the unexpected weight of it both a physical and an emotional reality. He felt the weight of their trust, their history, their profound gratitude. He looked at Ali, at the faces of the guardians, at the children watching with solemn eyes, and for a moment, he could not speak. He simply bowed his head in a gesture of profound respect and humility, an acknowledgement that he was receiving far more than he had ever given. The next morning, as the sun cast its first pale, gentle rays across the awakened land, the soldiers prepared to leave. The entire village was there to see them off. There were no formal goodbyes, no handshakes or stiff farewells. There was only a long, silent corridor of people lining the dusty track, their presence a living honor guard. As the engines of the trucks rumbled to life, a single, fluid movement rippled through the crowd. As one, they raised their hands. On nearly every wrist, from the smallest child to the oldest elder, was a simple, faded red armband, the mark of a guardian. It was a silent, powerful salute, a collective promise that they would remember, that they would protect the gift, and that they would carry the legacy forward. As the convoy began to move, pulling away in a slow cloud of red dust, the children broke from the line. They ran alongside the trucks, their small hands waving frantically, their voices a cheerful, poignant chorus ringing through the clear morning air, "Vietnam! Vietnam! Come back soon!" Major Ivanov watched them from the passenger seat of the lead truck until they were just small, receding figures in the swirling, sunlit dust. He looked down at the heavy stone resting on the seat beside him. It was more than a memento. It was a covenant. A legacy carved in stone. The convoy turned onto the main road, leaving the village of Kulul to its new, steady rhythm. But they had left something vital behind. A well, yes. But more than that. They had left a wellspring of hope. They had left a community that had rediscovered its own strength and dignity. They had left a permanent mark on the heart of a village that the world had once forgotten. And in that village, a simple, hand-carved stone was placed with reverence at the foot of the well, not as a memorial to men who had left, but as the foundation stone of a future that had just begun. The water would continue to flow, clean and constant, and with every single drop, it would whisper the story of how a small group of quiet soldiers from a distant land did not just dig a well, but unearthed a soul. A well cannot change the destiny of an entire nation. But one well, if dug with knowledge, humility, and love, can become a place where the heart of a community is reborn. The story of the Vietnamese soldiers in Kulul is not just about finding water in a dry land. It is a story about planting a seed of trust, and watching it grow into a forest of goodwill. It is a reminder that the most profound acts of service are often the quietest, performed not for recognition, but for humanity itself. The soldiers left, but their legacy remains, not just in the flowing water, but in the hands that now protect it, in the children who now dream of a healthier future, and in a name that will forever be spoken with love and gratitude, the Vietnam Well. Because true kindness never runs dry.